The screen tore through the trees before Mira even saw the shape of it. She dropped the basket of herbs she had been carrying and ran toward the sound, her bare feet slapping against wet leaves, her heart pounding harder than it ever had in her whole life. Something was dying in the woods, and every instinct in her small body told her to turn back, to run the other way, to remember that she was only an Omega, and Omegas did not go looking for trouble. But her feet kept moving anyway. She had lived on the edge of the Stonefang pack for as long as she could remember. Not truly inside it, not truly outside it either. The others called her the quiet one, the soft one, the girl who cried when a bird broke its wing. They said it like it was an insult, like gentleness was something shameful, something to be scrubbed off a person the way you scrub mud from your boots. Mira had stopped trying to explain herself years ago. She simply nodded, lowered her eyes, and went back to the only thing she was ever allowed to do well, healing. The forest around her thickened as she pushed deeper, branches scratching at her arms, the smell of pine and damp earth filling her lungs. She could hear voices now, low and urgent, the voices of hunters, Stonefang hunters. Her stomach dropped. If the pack's warriors were here, then whatever was making that terrible sound was already caught in something far more dangerous than a broken wing. She slowed as she reached the clearing, hiding behind the wide trunk of an old oak, peering around it with wide eyes. There, in the center of the clearing, stood 6 of the pack's strongest hunters, spears in hand, their faces set with the grim discipline that Stonefang trained into every warrior from childhood. And at the front of them, tall and broad-shouldered, stood the one person in the entire territory that every living creature feared, Kale, the Alpha. He was not shouting. He never needed to. His silence carried more weight than any other man's rage. His eyes, sharp and pale as winter ice, were fixed on something in the underbrush near his boots. Mira followed his gaze and felt her breath catch in her throat. A cub, a small gray wolf cub, barely old enough to have opened its eyes properly, lay trembling in the leaves. Its side was torn and bleeding, its breathing shallow and fast, the kind of fast that meant a body was running out of time. It had been separated from its den, probably chased off by rival wolves from beyond the ridge, and now it had nothing. No mother, no pack, no one. Kale raised his spear. Mira's hand flew to her mouth to keep herself from crying out. She knew the law. Everyone in Stonefang knew the law, whether they agreed with it or not. A creature too weak to survive on its own was a burden the pack could not carry. Mercy, the elders said, was not killing something quickly. Mercy was making sure it did not suffer any longer than it had to. It was the same reasoning that had shaped every hard, cold rule that governed her own life. The same reasoning that made her feel, most days, like she was one bad season away from being culled herself. She had seen Kale do this before. Everyone had. He was not cruel for the sake of it. He simply believed, all the way down to his bones, that strength was the only thing that kept a pack alive, and weakness was a wound that had to be closed quickly, before it spread and infected everyone around it. The cub whimpered again, a small broken sound, and something in Mira snapped. She did not remember deciding to move. One moment she was behind the tree, and the next she was walking into the clearing, her legs shaking, her chest tight with fear, every hunter's head turning toward her in shock. An Omega, alone, unarmed, walking directly into the middle of an armed hunting party, without being called. It was unthinkable. It was, by every rule she had been raised on, forbidden. Mira, one of the hunters, a young man named Brant, said her name like a warning, like he was trying to pull her back with just the sound of his voice. Get back, this isn't your place. She did not stop walking. Kale turned his head slightly, just enough to see her out of the corner of his eye, and for one long moment, the entire clearing seemed to hold its breath. No one interrupted the Alpha mid-hunt. No one, in the history of Stonefang, had ever dared to step between Kale and his spear. Move, Kale said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a blade through cloth. This does not concern you. Mira's whole body was trembling, but she kept walking, until she was standing directly between the Alpha and the cub, her back to the small dying creature, her front facing a man who could end her life with a single motion of his arm, and never lose a night of sleep over it. Please, she said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. Please don't. Kale's jaw tightened. Behind him, She could hear the other hunters shifting uneasily, waiting to see what their alpha would do. This was the kind of moment that pack stories were made of, the kind of moment people would whisper about for years, whether it ended in mercy or in something far worse. "You know the law," Kale said. "A creature this badly hurt will not survive the night. Every hour it stays alive, it suffers more. What you are asking me to do is crueler than what I am about to do." "Then let me try," Mira said. "Just let me try. If it dies anyway, then it dies with someone who cared enough to try to save it. That has to be worth something." For a long moment, Kale said nothing at all. His pale eyes studied her face the way a hunter studies tracks in the snow, searching for something he could not quite name. Mira had never been looked at like that before, not by anyone, and certainly not by him. Most of the pack looked through her, or past her, or not at all. Kale was looking directly at her, and it made her want to shrink into the ground, and also, strangely, to stand a little taller. "You have until sundown," he finally said. "If it is not improving by then, I will finish what needs to be finished. Do you understand me?" Mira nodded quickly, relief flooding through her chest, so fast it made her dizzy. "I understand." Kale lowered his spear, though he did not set it down. He gestured to the other hunters, and one by one they lowered their weapons too, watching their leader with expressions Mira could not quite read. Confusion, maybe, or something closer to surprise. Kale did not explain himself to them, and they did not ask. That was not how things worked in Stonefang. The Alpha's word was the only word that mattered, even when it surprised everyone who heard it, including, Mira suspected, the Alpha himself. She turned and knelt beside the cub immediately, her hands moving with the practiced gentleness of someone who had spent years tending to broken things no one else wanted to bother with. The cub's fur was matted with blood, its small body shaking with fear and pain. She spoke to it in a low, soothing voice, the same voice she used with every frightened creature she had ever helped, though she was not entirely sure the cub could understand her words. It seemed to understand her tone, at least. Its trembling slowed just slightly as she examined the wound along its side. It was bad, but not as bad as it looked. She had seen worse. The cut was deep, but had not reached anything vital, and the bleeding, while frightening, was already beginning to slow on its own. What the cub needed most was warmth, cleanliness, and time. 3 things that were very hard to find in the middle of a forest with an alpha and 5 armed hunters standing over her. "I need to take it somewhere I can properly clean the wound," she said, not looking up. "Somewhere warm and quiet." "You have until sundown," Kale repeated, as though she might have forgotten in the last 30 seconds. "Wherever you take it, one of my hunters goes with you." Mira did not argue. She knew better than to push her luck any further than she already had. She gathered the cub carefully into her arms, feeling its small heart hammering against her palm, and stood, cradling it against her chest, the way she imagined a mother might hold a newborn. Brant, the young hunter who had tried to warn her away earlier, was assigned to accompany her. He walked a few steps behind her, the entire way back to her small hut at the edge of the territory, saying nothing, though she could feel his eyes on her back the whole time, full of questions he clearly did not know how to ask. Kale did not come with them. He stood in the clearing long after Mira had disappeared into the trees, staring at the place where the cub had lain, turning something over in his mind that he could not quite put into words. He had killed weaker things before without a second thought. He had believed, truly believed, that it was the right thing to do, the only thing to do. So why, when the small Omega girl had stepped between him and his spear, had he not simply pushed her aside and finished what he had started? He told himself it was curiosity. He told himself he wanted to see if she could actually save the creature, or if her soft heart would only prolong its suffering and prove his point in the end. He told himself several things, standing alone in that clearing, with the sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, and none of them felt entirely true. Back at her hut, Mira laid the cub on a bed of clean cloth near the small fire she kept burning day and night. She worked quickly and carefully, cleaning the wound with water she had boiled earlier that morning, applying a paste made from herbs she had gathered and dried over many seasons of careful study. No one had ever taught her these things properly. She had learned them the way she learned everything, by watching, by trying, by failing many times before finally getting it right. Brant stood near the doorway, arms crossed, watching her work, with an expression that shifted slowly from suspicion to something closer to respect. "You've done this before," he said. "Many times," Mira answered, not looking up from her work. "Birds, mostly. Sometimes rabbits. Once a fox that had gotten its leg caught in something sharp." She paused, tying off a strip of cloth around the cub's middle. "This is the first wolf." "The alpha doesn't usually change his mind about things," Brant said carefully. "Once he decides, that's it. I've never seen him give someone until sundown before. I've never seen him give anyone a chance at all." Mira glanced up at him then, and something in her expression made Brant look away, embarrassed, as though he had said more than he meant to. The cub whimpered softly and shifted against the cloth, and Mira turned her full attention back to it, stroking its small head with 2 fingers, until its breathing steadied, and its eyes, glassy with pain, slowly began to close in something closer to rest than unconsciousness. She did not know, not really, whether it would survive the night. She only knew that she had to try, the same way she always tried, the same way she had tried her whole life to be more than what everyone believed an Omega was supposed to be. Outside, the sun continued its slow crawl toward the edge of the world, and somewhere beyond the trees, in the heart of the Stonefang territory, an alpha who had never once questioned his own laws, found himself, for the first time in years, unable to stop thinking about a girl he had been raised to believe meant nothing at all. The hours passed slowly. Mira did not leave the cub's side, not even for a moment. She fed it small amounts of warm broth from her fingertips, watched its wound for any sign of infection, and kept the fire steady so the small room stayed warm enough to help the healing along. Brant eventually sat down near the door, no longer watching her with suspicion, but with quiet curiosity, occasionally asking questions about the herbs she used, or how she had learned to recognize which plants helped and which ones harmed. She answered him honestly, grateful for the distraction, grateful for a moment where someone from the pack was speaking to her like a person, instead of a problem to be managed. As the light outside began to turn gold, then orange, then the deep red of an approaching sunset, Mira felt her chest tighten with a fear she had been trying to ignore all afternoon. The cub was breathing steadier, its color had improved slightly, but she did not know if that would be enough. She did not know if Kale would look at the small improvement and see hope, or if he would see only a wounded creature that had not yet proven it could survive on its own. She thought of his pale eyes studying her in the clearing, the way he had looked at her like she was something he had never encountered before. She did not know what to make of that look, and she told herself firmly that it did not matter. In a few hours, sundown would come, and with it, the alpha, and whatever decision he had already made long before he ever reached her door. The last light of the day slid through the gaps in the trees, when Kale finally appeared at the edge of Mira's small clearing. He walked alone this time, without the other hunters, his spear resting easily against his shoulder, rather than gripped tight in his fist. Mira heard his footsteps before she saw him, heavy and deliberate, and her stomach tightened into a knot she could not loosen. She stood in the doorway of her hut, blocking the entrance more out of instinct than any real belief that she could stop him if he decided to push past her. The cub lay behind her, wrapped snugly in clean cloth, its breathing slow and even for the first time since she had found it. It had taken a little broth an hour earlier and kept it down, which she had chosen to see as a good sign, though she knew better than most how quickly good signs could turn. Kale stopped a few feet away and studied her face for a long moment, before his eyes moved past her, into the dim room, where the small fire cast flickering shadows across the walls. "Show me," he said. Mira stepped aside, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. Kale ducked under the low doorway and crossed the small room in a few long strides, kneeling beside the cub with a care that surprised her, given the size of his hands and the roughness she had always assumed lived underneath his stillness. He examined the wound without touching it, his sharp eyes taking in the clean stitching, the careful wrapping, the steady rise and fall of the small chest beneath the cloth. "It's breathing evenly," he said, more to himself than to her. "It kept broth down twice," Mira added quickly. "The bleeding stopped hours ago. The wound isn't infected. I checked it every hour." Kale did not respond right away. He reached out, slowly, and rested 2 fingers against the cub's side, feeling the steady rhythm beneath the fur. For a moment, something shifted in his expression, something Mira could not name, but recognized instantly as rare. a crack in the armor he wore so constantly that most of the pack had probably forgotten he was capable of anything else. "You said until sundown," Mira said quietly, unable to stop herself. "The sun is down now." Cale looked up at her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Outside, the last traces of orange light faded from the sky, replaced by the pale blue of early evening. The fire crackled softly in the silence between them. "It's stable," Cale finally said. "That doesn't mean it's out of danger. Wounds like this can turn quickly." "I know," Mira said. "I'll watch it through the night. I always do. You've done this before, saved things others gave up on." It was not quite a question, but Mira answered it as if it were. "Whenever I could. Not everyone gets saved, but I try." Cale rose to his feet slowly, his tall frame filling the small space of her hut in a way that made her acutely aware of how little room there actually was between them. He looked down at the cub one more time, then back at her, and something in his expression had changed since he first walked in. Something quieter, something less certain than the cold authority she was used to seeing on his face. "The law exists for a reason," he said, almost as though he were reminding himself rather than her. "A pack cannot survive if it spends its strength on things that cannot survive on their own." "I'm not asking you to change the law," Mira said carefully. "I'm asking you to let this one small thing live. That's all. Just this one." Cale was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed somewhere past her, as though he were looking at something only he could see. When he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, rougher, almost as if the words cost him something to say. "It lives," he said, "for now. I'll come back in 3 days. If it's healing, it stays under your care until it's strong enough to be released back into the wild, or taken in by the pack, if it proves itself capable. If it isn't healing, the law stands." Relief crashed through Mira so suddenly that her knees nearly buckled. "Thank you," she breathed. "Thank you." Cale did not answer. He turned toward the door, then paused, his hand resting on the frame, his back still to her. "Why did you do it?" he asked. "Step in front of me like that. You had to know what could have happened." Mira thought about the question for a moment, choosing her words carefully, because she sensed, somehow, that this was not a question he asked lightly, and that her answer mattered more than she understood. "Because someone has to," she said. "Because if the only thing that matters is strength, then eventually all of us become something small and weak, at some point in our lives. And if no one steps in for the small and weak, then none of us are ever really safe, not even you." Cale was silent for a long moment. Then, without turning around, without another word, he stepped out into the darkening evening and disappeared into the trees, leaving Mira standing alone in the doorway of her hut, her heart still racing, the small cub sleeping peacefully behind her, for the first time since she had found it broken in the underbrush. She did not sleep much that night. She kept watch over the cub, checking its breathing, changing the cloth around its wound, feeding it small amounts of broth whenever it stirred enough to take them. But even in the quiet hours before dawn, when exhaustion finally pulled at her eyes and her body begged for rest, her mind kept returning to the image of Cale kneeling beside the cub, his fingers resting so gently against its side, his voice softening in a way she was certain no one else in the pack had ever heard. She told herself it meant nothing. Alphas did not soften. Alphas did not change. Cale had built his entire reputation, his entire identity, on being unshakable, unmovable, a wall no weakness could ever crack. Whatever she had seen in his eyes tonight was probably nothing more than curiosity, or perhaps simple exhaustion after a long day of hunting. But some small, quiet part of her, the same part that had made her walk into that clearing without thinking twice, refused to fully believe it. 3 days, she reminded herself, pulling the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders as the fire burned low. 3 days until he came back, until she would find out whether the fragile peace she had won in the clearing would hold, or whether it would shatter the moment the cub's recovery slowed even slightly. She glanced over at the small gray shape sleeping soundly beside the fire, its breathing steady, its small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that felt, for the first time all day, genuinely hopeful. Whatever happened next, she thought, at least tonight, the cub was alive. And for now, that would have to be enough. The 3 days that followed felt longer than any 3 days Mira had ever lived through. She rose before dawn each morning to check on the cub, boiling fresh water, changing the cloth wrapped around its healing wound, grinding new herbs when her supply of paste ran low. By the second day, the cub had opened its eyes fully for the first time, small and dark and curious, blinking up at her with an expression that made something warm bloom in her chest, despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of her body. She named it Ash, for the gray of its fur and the way it had come to her out of near ruin, like something rising from the ashes of a fire it should not have survived. She knew better than to grow too attached. Wild things belonged in the wild, and even if Ash lived, even if the wound healed clean and strong, there was no guarantee the pack would allow her to keep it, let alone that Kale would honor his word once the 3 days were finished. Word of what had happened in the clearing had already spread through the territory, the way news always did in a place where everyone lived close enough to hear each other's secrets carried on the wind. By the second day, Mira noticed the way people looked at her differently when she passed through the outer edges of the pack's gathering grounds to trade herbs for bread and salt. Some looked at her with open suspicion, as though she had done something dangerous and reckless that might bring trouble down on all of them. Others looked at her with something closer to wonder, whispering behind their hands about the Omega girl who had stopped the Alpha's spear with nothing but her bare hands and a few soft words. Neither reaction sat comfortably with her. She had not done what she did to become a topic of gossip. She had done it because in the moment, faced with a dying creature and a man ready to end its suffering, the only way he knew how, she simply could not stand by and watch. It had not felt like bravery at the time. It had felt like the only thing she could possibly do. Brant visited on the second day, bringing a small basket of dried meat and fresh bread that Mira suspected he had taken from his own share, rather than the pack's common stores. He sat with her for a while as she worked, watching Ash sleep by the fire, and though he did not say much, his presence felt easier than it had in the clearing, less like a guard watching a prisoner, and more like someone who had begun, cautiously, to see her differently. "The others are talking," he admitted eventually, breaking a piece of bread in half and setting it aside for her. "Some of them think you're brave, some of them think you're going to get yourself hurt, or worse, get the whole pack in trouble with the elders, for defying the law like that." "I didn't defy the law," Mira said, keeping her eyes on the herbs she was grinding. "The Alpha gave me permission. Twice now." "That's what worries them," Brant said quietly. "Kale's never given anyone permission to break with tradition before. Not once. Not in all the years he's led us." "People don't know what to make of it." Mira did not answer right away. She had been asking herself the same question every night since Kale left her doorway 3 nights ago, replaying the low, rough sound of his voice, the unexpected gentleness in his hands as he examined Ash's wound. She did not have an answer that made sense, not one she was willing to say out loud, not even to herself. "Maybe he just wanted to see if I could actually do it," she said finally. "Maybe once Ash is healed, everything will go back to the way it was." Brant studied her for a moment, something thoughtful in his expression, but he did not push the subject further. Instead, he asked about the herbs she was grinding, and Mira was grateful for the change of topic, grateful to fall back into the comfortable rhythm of teaching someone about the plants she had spent years learning to understand. By the third day, Ash was strong enough to stand on shaky legs for the first time, taking a few wobbling steps across the small hut before collapsing happily against Mira's knee, his tail giving the smallest, weakest wag she had ever seen. She laughed for the first time in days, a sound that surprised her with how easily it came, how light it felt in her chest after so many hours of worry. She was still smiling when she heard footsteps outside, heavier and more familiar than Brant's light tread, and her heart leapt into her throat as she turned toward the door. Kale stood in the entrance, tall and quiet, his pale eyes taking in the scene before him, the cub standing, however shakily, on his own 4 legs, his wound closed and clean, his coat beginning to regain some of its natural shine. Mira watched the Alpha's face carefully, searching for any sign of what he was thinking, but as always, his expression gave away almost nothing. 3 days, he said, stepping into the hut, his eyes moving from the cub to Mira and back again. "He's healing well," Mira said, standing to meet his gaze, despite the way her legs trembled slightly beneath her. "He stood for the first time an hour ago. He's eating on his own now, not just broth." Kale knelt down slowly, the way he had the first night, and held out one hand toward the cub, palm open, fingers relaxed. Ash sniffed cautiously at his hand, ears pinned back with uncertainty. before finally, tentatively, pressing his small nose against Kale's palm. Something flickered across the Alpha's face. Something Mira had never seen there before. Something almost soft. "He's strong," Kale said quietly. "Stronger than I expected." "He had a good reason to fight for it," Mira said. "Someone believed he could." Kale looked up at her then, and the silence between them stretched long enough that Mira felt her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear. There was something in his eyes she could not quite name, something that made the small hut feel smaller still, made the space between them feel charged with a tension she had never experienced before, not with anyone. "You were right," he finally said, rising to his feet. "About the pack. About what happens to us if the only thing that matters is strength." Mira blinked, startled by the admission. "I didn't expect you to say that." "I didn't expect to mean it," Kale admitted, and for the first time since she had met him, something that almost resembled a smile touched the corner of his mouth before disappearing just as quickly, as though he had caught himself and pulled it back. "If he heals fully and proves himself capable, the pack will decide whether to take him in as one of our own. That decision will not be mine alone to make." "Thank you," Mira said again, the words feeling too small for the weight of what he had just given her. Kale nodded once, then turned toward the door, pausing just as he had 3 nights before, his broad shoulders framed against the fading afternoon light. "I'll return in a week," he said, "to see how he's progressing." He left before Mira could respond, his footsteps fading into the trees, and she stood there for a long moment afterward, staring at the empty doorway, Ash leaning weakly but contentedly against her leg, her heart doing something strange and unfamiliar that she did not yet have a name for, though some quiet part of her already suspected she would need to find one soon. A week passed, and then another, and Kale's visits, which had begun as brief and businesslike checks on the cub's progress, slowly began to stretch longer than either of them seemed willing to admit out loud. He would arrive under the pretense of inspecting Ash's healing, kneel beside the cub for a few minutes, ask Mira a handful of questions about the herbs she used and the methods she had learned over the years, and then, more often than not, find some reason to stay a little while longer than necessary. Mira told herself it meant nothing. He was the Alpha. He had every right to check on a creature that would eventually belong to the pack, to make sure the decision he had made was the right one. But she noticed things she probably should not have noticed, the way his eyes lingered on her hands as she worked, the way his voice softened just slightly when he spoke to her, so different from the clipped, commanding tone he used with everyone else in the territory. Ash grew stronger with each passing day, his legs steadier, his coat thicker and glossier, his small body filling out with the kind of healthy weight that came from good food and careful attention. He had taken to following Mira everywhere she went within the boundaries of her small clearing, trotting at her heels like a shadow, occasionally letting out small excited yips whenever she returned from gathering herbs in the surrounding woods. It was during one of these gathering trips, deep in a part of the forest she rarely visited, that Mira first noticed she was being watched. She felt it before she saw anything, that prickling sensation at the back of her neck that told her, somehow, that she was not alone. She straightened slowly from where she had been kneeling beside a patch of healing moss, scanning the trees around her, her pulse quickening. "You wander farther than most," a voice said from somewhere in the shadows between the trees, and Mira turned to find a man she recognized but had never spoken to directly, one of the pack's senior warriors, a broad-shouldered man named Doran, who served as Kale's second in matters of hunting and defense. "I'm gathering herbs," Mira said carefully, straightening her spine, refusing to let her voice shake. "It's what I do." Doran stepped closer, his expression unreadable, his eyes moving over her with an assessment that made her skin crawl in a way that had nothing to do with the cold air. "Word travels fast in a pack this size. People are saying the Alpha visits your hut more often than the cub's healing requires." Mira's stomach tightened. "He's checking on Ash, that's all." "Is it?" Doran tilted his head slightly, and though his tone remained mild, there was something sharp underneath it, something that felt very deliberately aimed. "Kale has led this pack for 8 years, without once bending the law for anyone. Now suddenly, he's spending his afternoons in the hut of an Omega girl no one gave a second thought to before last month. You'll forgive me if I find that curious." "There's nothing to be curious about," Mira said, though her voice came out less steady than she wanted it to. Doran studied her for a moment longer, then smiled, a thin, cool expression that did not reach his eyes. Perhaps not, but some of us worry that softness spreads, once it's allowed a foothold. An alpha who bends the rules for a stray cub today might bend them for something far more dangerous tomorrow. Weakness has a way of growing, once it's given room. He turned and walked away, before Mira could find the words to respond, disappearing back into the trees as quietly as he had arrived, leaving her standing alone in the clearing, with her basket half full, and her heart pounding with a fear she had not felt since the day she first stepped between Cale and his spear. She did not tell Cale about the encounter when he visited later that evening, though she noticed, more than once, the way her hands trembled slightly as she prepared Ash's food, the way her mind kept drifting back to Doran's cold smile, and the warning wrapped so carefully inside his words. Cale noticed too, of course. He noticed everything, though he had grown skilled enough at hiding his observations that most people never realized how closely he was watching. "Something's troubling you," he said, settling onto the small wooden stool near the fire, while Ash chewed happily on a strip of dried meat at his feet. "It's nothing," Mira said quickly, too quickly. Cale's pale eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made it difficult to hold anything back from him, even things she desperately wanted to keep to herself. "Mira." She sighed, setting down the bowl she had been washing, and told him about the conversation with Doran, watching his expression carefully as she spoke, half expecting him to dismiss her concerns, the way he might have dismissed anything a month ago that threatened the careful order he had built his leadership around. Instead, his jaw tightened, and something dangerous flickered behind his eyes, something Mira had only glimpsed once before, on the day he had stood in the clearing with his spear raised, ready to end a life he believed could not be saved. "Doran has never approved of anything that doesn't fit neatly into his idea of strength," Cale said quietly. "He's ambitious, he's patient, and he's been waiting a long time for an opportunity to challenge my leadership without breaking the pack's rules of succession." "Do you think that's what this is?" Mira asked, alarm creeping into her voice. "An opportunity?" Cale was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, the shadows dancing across the sharp lines of his face. "I think," he said finally, "that Doran has just found the first real weakness he believes he can use against me, and I think he's not going to let it go easily." Mira felt a chill settle over her that had nothing to do with the cool evening air, seeping through the walls of her small hut. "What happens if he challenges you?" "Then I fight him," Cale said simply, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world, as though the possibility of violence between two men who had once hunted side by side did not carry any weight beyond the practical necessity of maintaining order. "And I win. I've beaten stronger challengers than Doran." "That's not what I meant," Mira said softly. "I meant, what happens to us? To Ash? To this?" She gestured vaguely between them, unsure how else to describe whatever it was that had grown, slowly and quietly, in the weeks since he had first knelt beside a dying cub and lowered his spear. Cale's expression softened, just slightly, and he reached out, hesitating for only a moment, before resting his hand gently over hers where it lay on the table between them. His palm was rough and warm, and Mira felt her breath catch at the simple contact, at the unfamiliar tenderness in a gesture from a man the entire pack believed incapable of such things. "I don't know," he admitted quietly, "but I know I'm not willing to go back to the way things were before. Not the law, not the way I led, not this." He glanced down at their hands, then back up at her face. "Whatever Doran plans to do, we'll face it, together, if you're willing." Mira nodded slowly, though the fear in her chest did not fully ease, not with Doran's cold smile still fresh in her memory, not with the quiet certainty in Cale's voice that a challenge was coming, sooner rather than later, and that when it arrived, everything they had carefully built in the weeks since Ash's rescue would be tested in ways neither of them could fully predict. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the branches against the roof of the hut, and Ash, sensing the tension in the room, pressed himself closer against Mira's leg, as if even the young cub understood that something difficult was gathering on the horizon, waiting for the right moment to arrive. The days that followed carried a tension Mira had never experienced before, a kind of quiet dread that settled over the territory like fog that refused to lift no matter how high the sun climbed. She noticed the whispers grow louder each time she walked through the pack's gathering grounds, noticed the way conversations paused when she passed, resuming only once she was far enough away to pretend she had not heard the way her name mixed with Cale's, in tones that ranged from curious to openly disapproving. Doran, it seemed, had not wasted the time since their encounter in the woods. He had been busy, quietly gathering allies among the pack's more traditional members, men and women who had grown uneasy watching their alpha soften in ways they did not understand, and more importantly, did not trust. Mira heard fragments of these conversations sometimes, carried on the wind or repeated by Brant, who had become, in the weeks since Ash's rescue, something close to a friend, someone willing to bring her news even when the news was not good. "They're saying the Alpha has lost his focus," Brant told her one afternoon, helping her carry water from the stream that ran along the edge of her small clearing, "that he spends more time here than he does managing the pack's affairs. Doran's been reminding people of every decision Cale's made in the last month that seems softer than before. The extended patrol he called off early. The dispute between the Ferris brothers that he settled with words instead of a formal challenge. None of those things were wrong," Mira said, frustration creeping into her voice despite her efforts to stay calm. "He made good decisions, fair decisions. Fair doesn't always feel safe to people who've spent their whole lives believing safety comes from strength alone," Brant said quietly. "Doran understands that fear better than anyone. He's using it." Mira set down the water jug harder than she meant to, watching the ripples spread across its surface, thinking of everything Cale had told her about his old friend, once a trusted second, now someone circling closer and closer to a challenge that felt, with each passing day, less like a possibility and more like an inevitability. Ash, now fully healed and growing quickly into a lean, healthy young wolf, trotted over and pressed his head against her leg, sensing, as he often seemed to, when her mood darkened. She knelt down and buried her fingers in his thick fur, grateful for the small comfort, even as her mind continued turning over everything Brant had told her. That evening, Cale arrived later than usual, his expression tighter than Mira had seen it in weeks, the easy warmth that had begun to soften his features during his visits, replaced by the guarded intensity she remembered from their very first meeting in the clearing. "Doran requested a formal gathering," he said without preamble, settling heavily onto the stool near the fire. "Tomorrow at midday, all senior members of the pack will be present." Mira's stomach dropped. A gathering for what? He hasn't said directly. He doesn't have to. Cale rubbed a hand across his jaw, weariness evident in every line of his broad shoulders. Everyone knows what it means when a challenger requests a gathering with the elders present. He's going to question my fitness to lead, in front of the entire pack, and he's going to use everything that's happened in the last month as his evidence. Can he do that? Just call a gathering and accuse you? It's within the old rules, Cale admitted. Rules I've honored my whole life, even when they worked against me. I can't refuse to answer without confirming everything he'll accuse me of. Weakness. Distraction. Placing sentiment above the pack's survival. Mira felt a familiar fear rising in her chest, sharper now than it had been in the woods with Doran, sharper even than it had been on the day she first stepped between Cale and his spear. What will you say? Cale was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. The truth, he finally said. That strength without mercy isn't strength at all. That a pack built entirely on fear eventually turns that fear inward, on itself, the same way it turns outward on everything else. I don't know if they'll listen. Doran has spent years cultivating loyalty among the older warriors. Many of them remember a time before I led, when the old Alpha ruled through fear alone, and some of them miss it, whether they'd admit it or not. And if they don't listen? Mira asked, though she already suspected the answer, could feel it settling over her like a shadow, long before he spoke the words aloud. Then Doran will formally challenge me, Cale said quietly, and under the old rules, I'll have no choice but to accept. Mira closed her eyes briefly, trying to steady the fear threatening to overwhelm her, trying to remember that Cale was strong, that he had led this pack successfully for 8 years, that he had faced challengers before, and emerged from every single one of them still standing at the head of Stonefang. But something about this felt different, felt more dangerous than any physical challenge could account for, because this was not simply a fight for leadership. This was a fight for the very idea that had begun growing between them since the day a small gray cub had trembled in the underbrush, and an alpha had chosen, for the first time in his life, to to listen to someone he had been raised to believe did not matter. "Whatever happens," Mira said finally, reaching across the small space between them to take his hand in both of hers, "I don't regret any of it. Not stepping in front of you that day. Not any of the days since." Cale's eyes softened, and for a moment, the weariness and tension in his face gave way to something gentler, something that made her chest ache, with an emotion she had never fully allowed herself to name until this exact moment, sitting beside a fire with a man the entire world believed incapable of tenderness, watching him look at her as though she were the single most important thing in a territory he had spent his whole life protecting. "Neither do I," he said quietly. "Whatever tomorrow brings, I want you to know that." They sat together for a long while after that, saying little, simply existing in each other's presence, while Ash slept curled between them near the fire, and outside, the wind carried the first cold breath of the coming season through the trees, as if even the forest itself understood that tomorrow would bring a change that could not be undone, no matter which way the gathering ultimately turned. Morning came too quickly, gray light filtering through the trees with none of its usual gentleness, as though even the sky understood the weight of what the day would bring. Mira barely slept, her mind cycling endlessly through everything Cale had told her, every possible outcome of the gathering that would determine not only his future as Alpha, but the future of everything that had grown quietly between them over the past weeks. She dressed carefully, though she was not entirely sure why it mattered, smoothing down the simple fabric of her tunic, tying her hair back with hands that would not quite stop trembling. Ash paced anxiously near the door, sensing her nerves, letting out small worried sounds that did little to settle her own racing heart. "I have to go," she told him softly, kneeling to press her forehead briefly against his. "Stay here. Stay safe." The walk to the pack's central gathering ground felt longer than she remembered it, every step carrying her closer to something she could not control, no matter how much she wished otherwise. By the time she arrived, the clearing was already filled with members of the pack, more people than she had ever seen gathered in one place, their voices a low murmur of tension and anticipation that seemed to hang in the cold morning air like smoke. She found a spot near the edge of the crowd, close enough to see, but far enough to avoid the attention she knew would only complicate things further. Whispers rippled through the gathering as people noticed her presence, but she kept her chin lifted, her eyes fixed forward, refusing to let their judgment shake the resolve she had spent the entire sleepless night building. Cale stood at the front of the clearing when the gathering formally began, tall and composed, his expression carved from the same unshakable stone she had first encountered on the day he raised his spear over a dying cub. Across from him stood Doran, flanked by several senior warriors whose loyalty had clearly, in the weeks since Ash's rescue, shifted firmly to his side. The elders, a small group of the pack's oldest and most respected members, sat on a raised platform of stone at the center of the clearing, their weathered faces betraying nothing, as Doran stepped forward to speak. "I called this gathering," Doran began, his voice carrying easily across the silent crowd, "because I believe our Alpha has lost sight of the principles that have kept this pack strong for generations. Strength, discipline, the willingness to make hard choices for the good of the whole, even when those choices are difficult." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Mira felt her stomach tighten as Doran continued, listing every decision Cale had made in recent weeks that deviated from the old ways, framing each one as evidence of a leader whose judgment could no longer be trusted. The spared cub, the softened patrol schedule. The disputes settled through discussion rather than formal challenge, and finally, the thing Mira knew he had been building toward from the very beginning. Our Alpha has allowed personal attachment to cloud decisions that should be guided only by what strengthens this pack, Doran said, his eyes flicking briefly toward Mira, before returning to the crowd. An Omega with no standing among us has somehow gained more influence over our leader's choices than the council of his own warriors. I ask this gathering, and I ask the elders who sit in judgment today, is this the leadership that Stonefang deserves, or has the time come for a change? Silence fell over the clearing, thick and heavy, and Mira felt every eye that had turned toward her during Doran's speech now shift back toward Cale, waiting, watching, uncertain which way the tide would ultimately turn. Cale stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the defensiveness Mira had half expected, none of the anger that might have been understandable, given the accusations laid so publicly against him. Instead, his tone was steady, calm, carrying the same quiet authority that had commanded this pack for 8 years without ever needing to be raised. Doran speaks of strength as though it exists apart from everything else that makes a pack worth protecting, Cale said. But I have led this territory long enough to understand something he has not yet learned. Strength that serves no purpose beyond itself is not strength at all. It's fear, wearing strength's clothing. A pack that survives by crushing anything it perceives as weak will, eventually, turn that same instinct on itself, because there will always be someone weaker to target, someone easier to blame, until there is nothing left standing but the strongest few, alone, having destroyed everyone who might have once called them family. He paused, his eyes moving slowly across the gathered crowd, finding faces he had led through hard winters and difficult seasons, people who had trusted him with their lives more times than any of them could count. I did not spare that cub because I grew weak, Cale continued. I spared it because a girl with no standing among us, as Doran puts it, showed more courage in that clearing than any warrior I have ever led. She stepped between me and my spear, unarmed, knowing exactly what could happen to her, because she believed that mercy and strength are not opposites. I have come to believe she was right. And I will not apologize for learning something true, simply because it came from someone the old ways taught me to overlook. The clearing remained silent for a long moment after he finished speaking, and Mira felt tears burning at the corners of her eyes, though she blinked them back quickly, refusing to let anyone see how deeply his words had moved her. Doran, however, was not finished. His expression hardened, and he stepped forward, his voice ringing out with a challenge that Mira had known, somewhere in the pit of her stomach since the moment this gathering was called, was always going to come. Pretty words, Doran said coldly, but words don't keep a pack fed through a hard winter, or protect our borders when rival packs test our strength. I formally challenge you, Cale, for leadership of Stonefang, under the old rules. Let strength decide what words cannot. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, and Mira's heart plummeted as she watched Cale's expression shift, the weariness in his eyes replaced by something colder, more resolute, the look of a man who had known this moment was coming, and had already, somewhere deep inside himself, made peace with what he would have to do. Then I accept, Cale said simply, his voice carrying no hesitation, no fear, only the quiet certainty of a leader who understood exactly what was now at stake, not only for himself, but for everything and everyone he had come, over the course of this strange and difficult month, to care for more deeply than he had ever believed himself capable of. The elders rose from their stone platform, one by one, and the eldest among them, a woman named Verna whose face bore the deep lines of nearly 70 winters, raised her hand for silence, before speaking words that settled over the clearing like a verdict already written. The challenge is accepted, under the old rules, she announced, her voice carrying the weight of tradition, older than anyone present could fully remember. Tomorrow, at sunrise, this matter will be settled before the full pack, by the strength of arms alone. Until then, let no further words be spoken on the matter. The forest will decide, as it always has, which of you deserves to lead. The crowd began to disperse slowly, whispers rising once again into a low, uncertain murmur, but Mira barely heard any of it. Her eyes were fixed on Cale, standing alone at the front of the clearing, and she felt, more strongly than she had felt anything in her entire life, the sudden and terrifying weight of everything that now rested on what would happen when the sun rose again over Stonefang territory. Mira found Cale that evening, near the edge of the training grounds, alone, running through slow, deliberate movements with a spear that caught the last light of the setting sun along its polished edge. She stood watching him for a long moment before he noticed her presence, his body moving with a controlled precision that spoke of years of discipline, every motion purposeful, every strike aimed at a target only he could see. You should be resting, she said softly, stepping closer. Cale lowered the spear, breathing steady despite the exertion evident in the sheen of sweat along his brow. I've fought before challenges more times than I can count. Rest rarely helps as much as preparation. Doran is strong, Mira said, unable to keep the worry from her voice. I've heard the others talk. He's one of the best fighters in the pack, second only to you. He is, Cale agreed simply, setting the spear aside and crossing the distance between them. But strength alone has never been the only thing that decides a challenge like this. Doran fights with anger. He's been carrying resentment for years, watching me lead a pack he believes he could lead better. And anger makes a fighter predictable, even when it also makes them dangerous. Mira reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses along his palm, the strength in his fingers as they closed gently around hers. "I'm frightened," she admitted, the words feeling strange and vulnerable in the quiet evening air. "Not just for you, for what happens to everything we've built, if tomorrow goes wrong." Cale was quiet for a moment, his pale eyes studying her face, with an intensity that made her chest ache. "I've spent my whole life believing that leadership meant never showing weakness, never admitting fear, never letting anyone see the parts of myself that doubted whether I was strong enough for what this pack needed from me. You changed that, not by asking me to be less than I am, but by showing me that mercy isn't the absence of strength. It's the hardest kind of strength there is." "And if Doran wins tomorrow?" Mira asked quietly, though she already dreaded the answer. "Then the pack will be led by fear again," Cale said, his voice heavy with the weight of that possibility. "And everything we've tried to build, everything Ash represents, everything you've taught me about what a pack could be, if it chose compassion alongside strength, will be undone. Doran will make sure of it. He'll want to erase every trace of what happened these past weeks, to prove that his way was right all along." Mira felt a fierce determination rise inside her, cutting through the fear that had gripped her chest all day. "Then you cannot lose." "I don't intend to," Cale said, and for the first time since the gathering that morning, something like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, small and tired, but genuine. "But whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that meeting you, that watching you kneel beside that cub and refuse to back down, even when facing my spear, changed something in me that I don't think can ever fully go back to what it was before. Win or lose tomorrow, that much will remain true." They stood together in the fading light for a long while, saying little more, simply drawing strength from each other's presence, the way they had grown accustomed to doing over the past weeks. When Cale finally walked her back toward her small hut at the edge of the territory, Ash greeted them at the door with an anxious energy that suggested he, too, sensed the weight of what tomorrow would bring. That night, Mira lay awake long after the fire had burned down to embers, staring up at the rough wooden beams of her ceiling, running through every possible outcome of the coming challenge. She thought about Doran's cold smile in the woods, his calculated speech during the gathering, the years of resentment he had clearly been nursing long before Ash's rescue had ever given him the excuse he needed to act on it. She thought, too, about everything the pack stood to lose if Cale fell tomorrow, not just for herself, not just for the fragile, precious thing that had grown between them since that first day in the clearing, but for every creature in the territory who might one day need the kind of mercy Cale had shown Ash, the kind of mercy that Doran's victory would erase entirely from the pack's understanding of what strength truly meant. She did not sleep much, and when the first gray light of dawn finally began creeping through the gaps in her walls, she rose with a heaviness in her chest that felt almost unbearable, dressing quickly, gathering a small satchel of herbs and clean cloth, though she prayed she would not need them, prayed that whatever happened at sunrise would not leave Cale in need of the healing skills she had spent her whole life developing. Ash whined softly as she prepared to leave, pressing himself against her legs, and she knelt to stroke his fur one last time before stepping out into the cold morning air, her breath visible in small clouds before her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fierce hope as she began the walk toward the clearing where, in a matter of hours, everything would finally be decided. The forest around her felt different this morning, quieter than usual, as though every creature within its boundaries understood that something significant was about to unfold beneath the rising sun. Mira walked steadily, refusing to let her fear slow her steps, refusing to let herself imagine anything other than the outcome she needed, more desperately than she had ever needed anything, to become real. By the time she reached the gathering ground, the crowd had already begun to assemble, larger even than the day before, every member of Stonefang present to witness the challenge that would determine the future of their pack. She found her place near the front this time, refusing to hide at the edges any longer, refusing to pretend that what happened today did not matter to her more than almost anything else in her life. Cale stood at one end of the clearing, calm and focused, his spear resting easily in his grip. Doran stood at the other, his expression hard and confident, clearly certain that today would end with him standing at the head of Stonefang, the old ways restored. Everything Kale had begun to build in the past month, swept away like footprints erased by falling snow. As the sun broke fully over the horizon, casting long golden light across the clearing, Verna rose once more from the Elder's platform, her weathered voice carrying clearly across the silent, waiting crowd. "The challenge begins," she declared, "and the forest will decide." The two men circled each other slowly at first, spears held ready, their eyes locked in silent assessment, each searching for the smallest opening the other might offer. The crowd held its breath, the only sound in the clearing the soft rustle of wind through the surrounding trees and the steady crunch of footsteps against frost-covered ground. Doran struck first, a fast, testing strike that Kale deflected easily with a small twist of his spear, the wooden shafts meeting with a sharp crack that echoed across the silent gathering. Doran pressed forward immediately, driven by the anger and ambition he had carried for years, each strike coming faster than the last, each one aimed with the precision of a man who had spent his entire life training for exactly this moment. Kale remained composed, giving ground when necessary, conserving his strength, reading the pattern of Doran's attacks with the calm focus that had made him such an effective leader in matters far beyond simple combat. Mira watched from the front of the crowd, her hands clenched tightly together, her heart hammering with every exchange, every near miss that sent gasps rippling through the watching pack. The contest stretched on, neither man gaining a clear advantage, both breathing harder as the sun climbed higher, sweat beading along their brows despite the cold morning air. Doran's strikes grew more desperate as time passed without the quick victory he had clearly expected, his movements beginning to carry the sloppiness of frustration rather than the disciplined precision he had shown at the start. Kale noticed the shift immediately, the same way he noticed everything, and Mira watched his expression change, a flicker of calculated patience, replacing the careful defense he had maintained throughout the early exchanges. He began to press forward now, matching Doran's speed, but with far greater control, forcing his opponent backward, step by step across the frozen ground. Doran stumbled slightly on a patch of uneven earth, and Kale seized the opening immediately, a swift, controlled motion that swept Doran's spear from his grip and sent it skittering across the clearing, leaving the challenger unarmed and off balance, staring up at Kale, who now stood over him with his own spear held steady, but not raised to strike. The clearing fell utterly silent, every eye in the gathering fixed on the two men, waiting to see what their alpha would choose to do, now that victory was so clearly within his grasp. The old ways would have demanded a decisive end, a clear and final statement of dominance that left no doubt about who held true strength. Mira held her breath, watching Kale's face, searching for any sign of what he intended, remembering, with sudden clarity, the moment weeks ago when he had stood over a dying cub with his spear raised, ready to follow the same unforgiving code that had shaped his entire life. Kale lowered his spear slowly, deliberately, until its point rested against the frozen ground rather than anywhere near the man kneeling before him. "Yield," Kale said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent clearing. "And this ends here. There's no honor in striking down a man who's already lost." Doran stared up at him, chest heaving, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something that looked almost like shame. For a long moment, he said nothing at all, and Mira wondered if he might refuse, might force Kale's hand into a decision neither of them truly wanted to make. Then, slowly, Doran lowered his head. "I yield," he said, the words clearly costing him something deep and difficult to release. "Stonefang remains yours to lead." A murmur swept through the crowd, disbelief giving way, slowly, to something that sounded almost like relief, almost like recognition of a strength they had not fully understood until this exact moment. Kale extended a hand toward Doran, helping him rise to his feet, and though the tension between the two men remained visible in the stiff set of their shoulders, something had shifted in the clearing that Mira could feel, even from where she stood, watching with tears, finally slipping freely down her cheeks. Verna rose from the Elder's platform once more, her weathered voice carrying the weight of a decision that would echo through Stonefang's history for generations to come. "The challenge is settled," she announced. "Kale remains alpha of this pack, and he has shown us something today that none of us expected to witness. True strength does not require destroying what has already fallen. Perhaps it never did. Perhaps we simply forgot, somewhere along the way, that mercy and power were never meant to stand as enemies. The crowd began to stir, whispers rising into something louder, something that sounded, to Mira's disbelieving ears, almost like approval, almost like a pack, slowly, cautiously, beginning to reconsider everything it had believed about what leadership truly required. Cale's eyes found hers across the clearing, and despite the exhaustion evident in every line of his body, despite the sweat and the strain of the contest still fresh upon him, something in his expression softened the moment their gazes met, something that spoke more clearly than any words could have managed, of gratitude, of relief, and of a bond between them that had, in the span of a single difficult morning, proven strong enough to withstand whatever challenges still lay ahead. In the days that followed the challenge, something in Stonefang began to shift, slowly at first, like ice cracking beneath the warmth of an early spring sun, then more noticeably as word spread of what had happened in that clearing, of an alpha who had chosen mercy even in victory, of a decision that had somehow made him seem stronger in the eyes of the pack, not weaker. Doran kept his distance in the days immediately following the challenge, his pride clearly still raw from the defeat, but Mira noticed, with quiet surprise, that he no longer spoke against Cale's leadership the way he once had. Whatever resentment had driven him to call that gathering seemed to have burned itself out somewhere in the frozen clearing, replaced by something more complicated, something closer to reluctant respect. Mira's own place within the pack began to change as well, though the transformation happened gradually. In small moments, she almost missed if she was not paying close attention. Warriors who had once looked past her without acknowledgement now nodded when she passed. Women who had once whispered behind their hands about her softness began, instead, to bring her their injured animals, their sick children, their sprained ankles and stubborn coughs, trusting her skills in ways they never had before. Ash, fully grown now into a strong, healthy young wolf, had become something of a favorite among the pack's children, who followed him through the territory with delighted laughter, marveling at the creature who had, in his own small way, become the spark that changed everything. Cale had made good on his promise weeks earlier, allowing Ash to remain within Stonefang's territory as one of their own, a living reminder of the day mercy had proven itself stronger than any spear. Cale visited Mira's hut nearly every evening now, no longer bothering to construct excuses about checking on the cub's progress, no longer pretending that his presence there was anything other than exactly what it had become. They sat together beside the fire most nights, talking about small things and large things in equal measure, about the changes slowly reshaping the pack, about the future neither of them had ever expected to share when Mira first stepped into that clearing weeks ago, unarmed and terrified, prepared to face an alpha's spear for the sake of a dying stranger. "The elders have been talking," Cale told her one evening, several weeks after the challenge, his expression thoughtful as he stared into the flickering fire, "about formally changing the old laws, about writing mercy into the code that guides how we treat the weak and the wounded, rather than leaving it to chance, to whether or not an alpha happens to have a soft heart hidden somewhere beneath the armor." Mira looked up at him, surprised. "They want to change the laws?" "Verna has been arguing for it since the challenge," Cale said. "She says what happened that day, what's happened in the weeks since, proves something the old ways never accounted for. That a pack built entirely on strength eventually turns brittle, because strength alone can't hold people together the way trust and compassion can. She's not wrong." "And what do you think?" Mira asked softly, though she suspected she already knew his answer. Cale reached across the small space between them and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle patterns across her knuckles. "I think I spent 8 years leading this pack by a code I never fully questioned, because questioning it felt like weakness, and weakness felt like the one thing I could never afford to show. Then, a girl with no standing among us stepped between me and my own spear and taught me that the bravest thing I ever did wasn't leading warriors into battle. It was choosing to listen to someone the world had taught me to overlook." Mira felt her eyes burn with unshed tears, moved by the quiet sincerity in his voice, by the enormous distance he had traveled from the man who had once stood ready to end a dying cub's suffering without a second thought. "I never wanted to change who you are," she said softly. "I only wanted you to see that strength and mercy could exist together. That they always could have." "You didn't change who I am," Cale said, lifting her hand to press a gentle kiss against her knuckles, a gesture so unexpectedly tender that it stole the breath from her lungs. You helped me become who I was always meant to be, before the old ways convinced me that gentleness was something to bury, rather than something to protect. Outside, the wind carried the first true chill of the coming winter through the trees, but inside the small hut, warmed by fire and by something far more enduring than flame, Mira felt a peace settle over her that she had never known was possible. Not for someone born into the lowest rank her pack recognized, not for someone who had spent her whole life believing she would always exist at the margins, valued only for the small, quiet skills no one else wanted to bother learning. Ash stirred in his sleep near the fire, letting out a soft, contented sound, and Mira found herself smiling at the sight of him, this small creature who had, through nothing more than his own fragile survival, brought together two people the world had never expected to find common ground, let alone something as rare and precious as what had grown steadily between them in the weeks since that first desperate afternoon in the clearing. Spring arrived early that year, or perhaps it only seemed that way to Mira, who found herself noticing every small sign of new growth with a lightness in her chest that had never come so easily before. The territory around Stonefang bloomed slowly back to life, snow melting from the high ridges, streams swelling with fresh water, the forest filling once again with the sounds of birds returning from their long winter absence. The formal gathering that would decide the fate of the old laws took place beneath a clear blue sky. The entire pack assembled once more, in the same clearing where Kale had faced Doran's challenge months earlier, though the mood this time carried none of the fear and uncertainty that had hung over that earlier meeting. Instead, there was a kind of quiet anticipation among the gathered crowd, a sense that something significant, something good, was about to be settled. Verna stood at the center of the clearing, flanked by the other elders, her weathered face carrying an expression of solemn pride as she addressed the assembled pack. For generations, she began, Stonefang has survived by one simple code: strength above all else. Weakness culled before it could spread. It kept us alive through hard winters and harder enemies. But survival was never meant to be the only measure of a pack's worth. She paused, her eyes finding Mira in the crowd, and something warm passed between them, an acknowledgement that needed no further words to carry its full weight. This past season, our Alpha showed us something the old code never accounted for, Verna continued. That mercy offered wisely does not weaken a pack, it strengthens the bonds between us, builds trust where fear once stood alone, and ensures that when any one of us falls, weak or wounded, young or old, we will not simply be discarded, but cared for, the way a true family cares for its own. She turned to Kale, who stood beside her, tall and steady, his pale eyes moving across the crowd with the quiet confidence of a leader who had, over the course of one difficult season, earned something far more valuable than simple obedience. From this day forward, Verna announced, the Code of Stonefang will honor both strength and compassion as equal pillars of what makes this pack worthy of survival. No creature, wolf or otherwise, will be discarded simply for being wounded or weak. So long as there is a reasonable hope of healing, strength will still guide our defense, our hunts, our discipline. But mercy will guide our hearts, and never again will the two be treated as enemies. A wave of sound swept through the gathered crowd, not the murmured uncertainty of the earlier gathering, but something closer to genuine approval, voices rising together in a way that made Mira's chest swell with an emotion too large to fully contain. Kale stepped forward then, raising a hand for quiet, and when the crowd settled, he spoke with a warmth in his voice that Mira had only ever heard directed at her, now offered freely, to the entire pack he had spent 8 years, leading through fear alone, and would now lead, for however many years remained ahead of him, through something far more enduring. I stand before you today, a different leader than the one who once raised his spear over a dying cub, without a second thought, Kale said. I am not ashamed of that change. I am grateful for it, and grateful to the person who showed me the path toward it, when every instinct I had been trained to trust told me to push her aside and finish what I had already decided to do. His eyes found Mira across the clearing, and he extended a hand toward her, an invitation offered in front of the entire watching pack, a gesture that carried more weight than any formal declaration could have managed. Mira felt every eye in the clearing turn toward her as she stepped forward, her heart racing, her legs carrying her across the frozen ground, with a confidence she never could have imagined possessing when she first arrived at this same clearing months ago, hiding behind an old oak tree, terrified of what she might witness. She reached Cale's side, and he took her hand in his, turning to face the pack together. Two people who had once stood on opposite sides of an impossible divide, now standing united, before the very community that had once dismissed one of them as too soft to matter. "This pack survives because of strength," Cale said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent clearing. "But it thrives because of compassion. I intend to lead Stonefang with both, for as long as I am given the honor of leading at all, and I could not do so without the woman standing beside me today, who taught an entire pack that dropping a spear can sometimes be the bravest choice a person ever makes." The clearing erupted into sound, warriors and elders and children alike, raising their voices in something that felt, to Mira's overwhelmed heart, like genuine celebration, and somewhere near the edge of the crowd, Ash let out an excited bark, bounding through the gathering to press himself happily against her legs, as though he understood, in whatever way a wolf could understand such things, that the small, desperate choice he had made to survive that day in the underbrush had rippled outward into something far larger than either he or Mira could have ever imagined. Standing there beneath the clear spring sky, surrounded by a pack that had once seen her as nothing, now watching her with something closer to respect and warmth than she had ever dared to hope for, Mira thought back to the moment that had started it all, the moment she had stepped between an alpha and his spear, guided by nothing more than the simple belief that every living thing deserved a chance to be saved. She had been right, she realized, watching Cale smile down at her with a warmth that still occasionally surprised them both, that mercy and strength were never meant to be enemies. Sometimes, all it took to prove that truth to an entire pack was one quiet kiss, pressed gently against a dying cub's forehead, and the courage to believe, against every rule she had ever been taught, that compassion was never truly weakness at all.